The moment my husband's lawyer looked at me across the courtroom and smiled, not a polite smile, the kind that says we've already won, I almost let him have it. Almost. I'd been awake since 4 that morning. I'd ironed my blazer twice. I'd stood in the bathroom mirror rehearsing how to keep my voice steady when I spoke. And I still wasn't sure I could do it. But I sat down at that table alone, set my folder in front of me, and I did not look away from him. His lawyer's name was Mr. Ashby. He had silver cufflinks and a watch that cost more than my first car. He leaned over to my husband and whispered something, and my husband, the man I'd spent 9 years building a life with, laughed. Quietly, into his hand. Like a child who'd been told not to make noise but couldn't help himself. That was the moment I stopped being afraid. Let me go back. My name is Adrian. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where everyone mows their lawn on Saturday mornings and knows exactly which houses have trouble behind closed doors. I was the first in my family to graduate college. I worked 2 jobs to do it. I got my degree in accounting, passed my CPA exam on the first try, and took a job at a mid-size firm in Atlanta before I turned 24. I was good at my job. I was precise and patient, and I could look at a set of numbers and feel, the way some people feel music, exactly where the wrong note was hiding. My supervisor said I had a gift for it. She wasn't flattering me. She was the kind of woman who didn't flatter people. I met my husband at a client dinner. He was the CFO of a regional construction company, Crestfield Group, $12 million in annual revenue, a good reputation. He was charming and attentive, and he asked me questions about my work like he genuinely wanted to understand the answers. We dated for 2 years. We got married in a small ceremony in Savannah. His mother cried. My mother cried. It felt real. For a while it was real. 2 years into our marriage, his company's internal accountant quit suddenly. He asked me to step in temporarily, just to get them through an audit. I agreed. Temporary became 6 months. 6 months became a year. And somewhere in there, I stopped being a CPA with her own career and became the woman who handled the books for her husband's company, unpaid, while also managing our household, our social calendar, and the lease renewals on 3 properties he'd bought as investments before we married. I told myself I was being a partner. I told myself it would even out. It didn't. The first time I noticed something off in the financials, I assumed it was a categorization error. There was a vendor, listed as Pembroke Consulting, that had received payments totaling around $40,000 over the course of 14 months. I couldn't find a contract for them. I couldn't find any deliverable, any invoice detail, any record of what they'd actually provided. When I asked my husband, he told me it was a strategic advisory relationship, very informal, and I didn't need to worry about it. I wrote it down. I kept working. By the time I found the second vendor, Tallow and Reed, another $62,000, and then the third, I had stopped assuming anything. I didn't say a word. I made copies of everything. I organized it into a folder that I kept at my sister's house, not mine. I told her not to ask me questions about it, and she didn't because she knows me well enough to understand that when I get quiet, something serious is happening. I don't think my husband noticed the shift in me, which tells you something about how present he actually was. The night he told me he wanted a divorce, he'd already moved most of his personal accounts. I know this because I saw the transfers. I wasn't snooping. They went through accounts I had access to. He'd moved a substantial amount into an LLC I didn't recognize, one that had been registered in Delaware 3 months earlier. I found that out later. At the time, I just watched him set his glass of bourbon on the kitchen counter and say, with the kind of practiced calm that means someone has rehearsed this, that things weren't working for him anymore, and he thought it was better to end it cleanly. Cleanly. He said he had an attorney who would handle everything and it would be straightforward. Then he told me that given the circumstances, meaning given that I hadn't had a salaried job in over 2 years and had been entirely dependent on him, I probably couldn't afford a lawyer of my own, and it might be easier to just work through his. He wasn't cruel when he said it. That was the thing I kept coming back to later. He said it like he was being helpful. I told him I'd think about it. 2 days later, I came home and my clothes were in bags on the front steps. Not suitcases, bags. The kind you use for yard waste. My neighbor Gretchen was walking her dog, and she stopped and looked at those bags, and then looked at me. And I could see on her face that she didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to say either. I picked up the bags and put them in my car, and I drove to my sister's house, and I sat in her kitchen for about an hour without speaking. Then I made some calls. The first call was to a woman I'd worked with early in my career. She'd left our firm to work as a forensic accountant, the kind that consults on fraud cases. I explained what I'd found. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Adrian, you need to understand what you're looking at." She walked me through it carefully, and by the end of the call, I understood exactly what I was looking at. The second call was to the IRS whistleblower office. I'm not going to dramatize that call. It was procedural and careful, and I had documentation that I'd been accumulating for almost 2 years. I submitted a formal disclosure. I was told the process takes time. I said I understood. The third call was to my State Bar Association's referral line, where they connected me with a family law attorney for a 1-hour consultation. After that hour, I had a clear enough picture to decide that I was going to represent myself in the divorce proceedings. Not because I couldn't find a lawyer, because I didn't need one to do what I needed to do. My husband's attorney was very thorough in his first filing. He argued that I had no claim to marital assets because I had contributed nothing financially during the period in question, that the properties were acquired before our marriage, and that any work I'd done for Crestfield Group was informal and voluntary and carried no compensation claim. He used the word informal 4 times in 12 pages. I counted. What he did not know, what my husband did not know, was that I had quietly filed my own documentation with the court 3 weeks before the hearing. A complete set of records showing the hours I'd worked for Crestfield, the deliverables I'd produced, the audits I'd managed, and a conservative calculation of what that work would have cost on the open market. $61,000, conservatively. I was careful to be conservative. I also attached as exhibits the financial records I'd been keeping. I didn't allege anything. I just attached them as context for the nature of my work at the company and what I had observed in the course of performing it. I was meticulous about language. Every word in that filing was chosen for a reason. The night before the hearing, I ironed my blazer. I ate dinner. I went to sleep at 10 o'clock because I needed to be sharp, and I knew panic would not help me. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights that hummed slightly, rows of plastic chairs. My husband was already seated when I arrived, wearing a suit I recognized. Charcoal gray, the one he wore to important meetings. His attorney sat beside him, arranging papers. There were 2 other people at their table who I assumed were support staff. I sat at the table across from them, alone, with my folder. Mr. Ashby looked over at me the way people look at someone who has made an obvious mistake. The smile was brief, polished, a professional courtesy to someone he had already dismissed. My husband didn't look at me at all. The judge entered. Her name was Judge Calloway. She was a woman in her late 50s, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she moved through the courtroom like someone who had seen every version of every situation and had stopped being surprised a long time ago. She reviewed the docket, settled into her chair, and picked up a stack of papers. She paused. She set the papers down. She picked up a specific page. I could see from where I was sitting that it was part of my filing, and she read it again. Then she looked up over her glasses, not at Mr. Ashby, not at my husband, at me. "You filed these exhibits yourself?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor." "And you prepared this valuation?" "Yes, Your Honor. I'm a CPA, licensed in Georgia. I prepared the valuation using standard industry billing rates, discounted by 20 to account for the informal nature of the arrangement." There was a pause. Mr. Ashby shifted in his seat. "Counselor," Judge Calloway said to him, still looking at my filing, "were you aware of the extent of the respondent's professional background when you drafted your characterization of her contributions as informal and voluntary?" The word informal landed differently the 4th time. "Mr. Prussian," Ashby said with admirable composure that he had relied on information provided by his client. "I see," said Judge Calloway. She set the papers down and looked at the room with an expression I couldn't entirely read, Not warm, not hostile, simply alert. We'll proceed. I won't walk you through every argument of that hearing because some of it was tedious and some of it was technical and you don't need the procedural details to understand what happened. What happened was this. Every time Mr. Ashby framed my contributions as negligible, I had documentation that said otherwise. Every time he implied I had no standing, I had a statute that said otherwise. I had prepared 73 pages of exhibits, and I knew every one of them. I had anticipated his arguments because they were the obvious arguments, and obvious arguments are easy to prepare for. He was good. I want to be fair. He was skilled and experienced and under different circumstances, against a different opponent. His strategy would have worked. It just didn't work on me. At one point, he said that my financial claims against the company were outside the scope of divorce proceedings and should be pursued separately. I responded that the unpaid compensation formed part of the marital estate calculation under Georgia Statute 1939, cited the case law, and handed a copy to the clerk for the record. Judge Calloway made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Mr. Ashby did not respond immediately. My husband was very still throughout all of this. I noticed at some point around the middle of the hearing that his stillness had changed character. It was no longer the stillness of someone who is bored and certain. It was the stillness of someone who is trying not to show that something has gone wrong. The hearing recessed for 40 minutes. I sat in the hallway outside and ate half a granola bar and drank water, and did not look at my phone. My husband and his attorney were down the hall speaking quietly and quickly. I did not try to hear what they were saying. When we reconvened, there was an additional person in the room, a woman in the dark blazer who sat in the gallery and did not announce herself. I noticed her. I recognized the type, if not the face. She had a small notebook and she was writing in it before the judge even sat down. Judge Calloway ruled that my valuation of unpaid professional services was admissible and credible. She ruled that 3 of the 4 investment properties fell within the scope of marital asset division due to my documented contributions to their management. She noted for the record that she found the characterization of my work as informal and voluntary to be, in her words, inconsistent with the evidence. As we were preparing to close, Judge Calloway looked at me again. Ms. Aldridge, she said. She used my maiden name, which I'd listed in my filing. I'd recommend, going forward, that you retain representation. You clearly know what you're doing, but having counsel will serve you in subsequent proceedings. Thank you, Your Honor, I said. I'll take that under advisement. Mr. Ashby was already packing his briefcase. My husband stood up and I looked at him for the first time that morning. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who has just understood something he should have understood much earlier and cannot decide how he feels about it yet. She introduced herself as an agent with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. She said she couldn't discuss the specifics of any ongoing review, but she asked if I was the same Adrian Aldridge who had submitted a disclosure through the whistleblower program. I confirmed that I was. She handed me a card and said they might be in touch. She was in touch. I'm not going to detail what happened next with the financial investigation because some of it is still ongoing and it's not my story to tell in full. What I can tell you is that Crestfield Group is currently under federal review. What I can tell you is that several of the vendor entities my husband had been routing payments through were traced to accounts he controlled personally. What I can tell you is that the Delaware LLC I'd found in the transfer records was one of them. He had been so certain I wouldn't understand what I was looking at. He had spent 9 years watching me work with numbers, and he had still been certain I wouldn't understand. My sister picked me up after the hearing. She'd been waiting in the parking lot for 3 hours, reading a novel and eating chips, because that's who she is. When I got in the car, she looked at my face and said, "How bad was it?" I said, "It wasn't bad." She stared at me. "Did you win?" I thought about that word, win. Whether the correct word for what had happened was winning. I had been married for 6 years to someone who had systematically underestimated me, used my skills without acknowledging them, and then left yard waste bags on my front steps and told me, with genuine confidence, that I probably couldn't afford to fight back. "I think so," I said. She threw her chips in the back seat and hugged me, which made both of us laugh, and then she drove us to a diner and bought me pancakes and we sat there for 2 hours in a booth by the window and the sun came through the glass and it was ordinary and warm and it was mine. There are things I want to say to anyone who is in the version of this situation I was in 2 years ago. The version before the hearing, before the piling, before the granola bar in the hallway, the version where someone looks you in the eye and tells you with total confidence that you don't have the means to stand up for yourself. Here's what I know. They're not always wrong that you don't have money. They're not always wrong that the system is complicated. What they are almost always wrong about is what you are capable of understanding and preparing for and walking through, quietly over time without making a sound. I didn't win because I was lucky. I didn't win because I was lucky. I didn't win because I happened to have a skill set. I won because I paid attention when everyone assumed I wasn't, and I documented everything, and I did not panic in the parking lot or the kitchen or the courthouse hallway even when I very much wanted to. I still have the folder. I keep it in my filing cabinet at my apartment, the one I chose, in a neighborhood I like, near a coffee shop where the barista already knows my order. Every once in a while, I open that cabinet and I look at it, not to relive anything, just to remember that I saw the wrong note hiding in the numbers. I saw it early, and I didn't say a word until I was ready. I've thought a lot about the word informal, the way Mr. Ashby used it, 4 times, the way my husband must have used it first, probably sitting in that same law office, explaining away 6 years of my work in a single adjective, informal, like what I didn't have a shape or a weight or a dollar amount attached to it. That word tells you everything about how he saw me, and, honestly, how I'd started to see myself toward the end. I'd gotten so used to being useful in ways that didn't get counted that I'd almost stopped counting them too. That's the part that stays with me. Not the yard waste bags, not the transferred accounts, the fact that I had almost convinced myself he was right. Here's what I know now. On the other side of it, what happened to me wasn't random bad luck. There's a logic to it that I can trace clearly, even when it's uncomfortable to do so. He behaved the way he did because nothing had ever cost him anything. Every time I absorbed a burden without saying a word, every time I let something go because I didn't want conflict, every time I picked up the slack without asking to be acknowledged, I taught him that my labor was free, and my silence was guaranteed. I don't say that to blame myself. I say it because understanding it is the only thing that makes it useful. And here is the other side of that same logic. The preparation I did, the documentation, the quiet years of paying attention while he assumed I wasn't, that wasn't luck either. That was the same precision I'd always had, pointed in a different direction. The same person who managed his company's books was the person who eventually understood exactly what those books revealed. He never separated those two things in his mind, because he never thought of me as a whole person with a continuous history. He thought of me as a role. Wife. Unpaid accountant. Liability. What I want to say, not as a lesson, because I'm not in a position to hand out lessons, but as something I genuinely wish someone had said to me earlier. The intelligence and the discipline you use to survive something hard don't disappear when the hard thing is over. They go with you. I walked out of that courtroom with the same mind I walked in with. I sat in my sister's car with the same capacity for careful thinking that I'd used to build 73 pages of exhibits. Those things were always mine. They were never contingent on him or his approval or his assessment of what I was worth. Adrian, that's who I am. Not someone's wife who used to be a CPA. Not a woman who got left. A person who paid attention, documented everything, and showed up alone to a table with 3 people on the other side and did not lose her nerve. That's not a special gift. That's a decision made over and over again in the months before anyone was watching. Integrity is mostly invisible. It's the choice to write something down when no one told you to. It's keeping the folder at your sister's house. It's going to sleep at 10 o'clock the night before because you know panic won't serve you. I think about that sometimes. How much of what saved me happened in private, slowly, without any drama at all. The dramatic part, the courtroom, the silence, the IRS agent in the hallway, that was just the end of a much longer, much quieter story. And that quieter story is the one that actually mattered.